is Bharat. I have the pleasure of moderating this evening session on SDG 11. It's great to have all of you here. I am a director for investments with the Omidyar network, and it's an absolute privilege to have all of you here and to moderate this discussion on such an important topic. What we'll do is to very quickly set context for why we are doing this, and then I'll introduce a couple of lead discussants that we have, and then turn it over to them with quick questions. I know we have a lot of people in the room who would want to participate and jump into the conversation. And so what I'd request each of the lead discussants to do is to keep their initial sort of comments brief so that we can bring as many people into the conversation as possible. Okay. The context for today's discussion on SDG 11, which is about sustainable cities and communities, is of course the fact that over half of humanity now lives in cities. And this is around the globe, and specifically here in India, we've just crossed about 30% of the population living in cities. Now, there's already very compelling research by the likes of the IDFC Institute that suggests that even in India, the number is actually closer to 50%. Because when you look at the amount of sort of migration that has happened into cities in a reasonably unplanned manner, and when you look at urban agglomerations and the peripheries of them, where the boundaries have still not been redrawn and they've not been redefined. So if you look at the actual proportions of people living in these urban agglomerations, it's already close to 50%. And of course, that's bringing challenges in its way. The estimate is that about 17% of urban population in India lives in slums. And of course, when you look at another dimension of it, we are generating over 60 million tons of waste every day from our cities. And of course, that is a massive challenge. So there are two specific topics among the swathe of conversations that we could have had on SDG 11 that we wanted to focus in particular on. The first is housing and the second is waste, both because of the fact that these are critical topics, but also because a lot has been done from the point of view of the government here in India on these two specific topics. And I should also say that in addition to Omidyar Network, Asha Impact, as well as the eGovernments Foundation, have helped curate this session and to put it together. So a huge thanks to the team from Asha Impact as well as from the eGov Foundation for their help in curating this session. Just to quickly introduce the lead discussants that we have in the room. Ajit Pai is a consultant with the NITI Aayog, and we'll hear from him in terms of some of the challenges and the perspectives from the government. We have Shekar here, a director at the United Nations Information Center for India and Bhutan, and we'll hear from Dirk as well shortly. Viraj Tyagi is the CEO of the eGovernments Foundation, and again, eGov has been instrumental in helping put this session together. And we have Vikram Gandhi here as well, who is the founder of Asha Impact and a professor at the Harvard Business School. So, a really good group of discussants, as well as a number of other sector experts that we have here. And without sort of too much more by way of context, what I wanted to do is to bring each of them into the discussion. I wanted to start first, maybe if I could, with you, Dirk, by just having you comment on the ways in which the UN has been working with other countries and also with India specifically on issues around SDG 11. So if you could tell us a bit more about that to kick the discussion.
Thank you so much, Bharat. So I think the UN is there always to support governments and citizens in the work that they are already doing and supporting in their priorities. I think the key thing in this area is that we really try to remind our counterparts and governments around the world that this is really a huge challenge. You see the amount of growth, the growth of urban populations, urban cities. And so that not incremental change is needed, but transformational change. So it is really about keep on pushing our counterparts to up their ambition level, because if you just look at India alone, right, probably about 40 to 50% of your urban areas in 2030 still needs to be built, right? So it's a huge challenge, but also a huge opportunity if we can get it right together in terms of sustainability. Another thing we really work with is to really, if we talk about sustainable cities, to really look at the wide range of issues that come into play to make urban spaces sustainable. We focus now especially on waste management and sustainable housing, which are huge issues here. But obviously there are issues like power generation, which is a huge issue. Transportation systems, which is a huge issue. Something that's often overlooked is disaster risk reduction. right? Because just too often issues are just, cities are built very quickly without taking risk into account. If you just look at Delhi and the risk for major earthquakes, it's something to keep in mind that you really do not want your major infrastructure to collapse. And also, don't forget rural, right? We're talking about cities, but it is embedded in rural areas, right? And if you look at air pollution, for example, very often, large parts here, also including here, that it comes from rural areas. The water consumption, is in agriculture is the highest, in any sector. So you really need to look at this holistically. That's the kind of stuff that we come in and do. And in really concrete terms, including here in India, we work very closely with NITI on issues of data to make sure that things are measurable. If you really want everybody to be engaged, you need to be able to measure it, to measure impact. So it's very important that the way we measure contributions to SDGs, but also obviously to national development indicators, that the local ones and the national ones and the international ones are aligned, and that also that there's clarity and transparency for businesses that they know what to measure against. So to develop those kind of data systems, the criteria, the indicators, but also then links to credible certification in terms of business contributions, I think is a key area that the UN works in almost around the world. Two other ones is to have feedback mechanisms and platforms, apps, etc. for citizen feedback. I think is very important, to really have those kind of holistic approaches that you get all the partners on board. So there are very interesting examples of how, at scale, citizen feedback and engagement is rolled in. And another really important one is to really focus on democratizing solutions. Understanding that yes, government can do a lot, business can do a lot, but if it only ends up with big mega projects, we're not moving fast enough. It's again about the scale we're talking about. So we need solutions that individuals can implement. Like putting solar panels on their own roofs and then feeding it into the grid and then having it as a money-making proposition. Those kind of situations, so you don't have to wait for either the government or business to roll out very large programs, that you really provide solutions that every single individual can pick up and then start using. Solar stoves is another one, but there are many of these ones really. If you look especially for the scale of India, you need democratic solutions to really make a dent within the next 5 to 10 years.
Terrific, thanks a ton, Dirk. I wanted to keep the discussion off on housing to focus on that sector in particular. It's something that you mentioned as well, Dirk. But of course, there is a clear macro need for more housing, with 17% of India's urban population living in slums at the moment. And with things like the Housing for All program, the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, there is clearly the right macro environment that is being created for it. And yet, group housing has not necessarily taken off as planned or as envisaged. So I wanted to understand from the point of view of Asha Impact, which has done a lot of work in this area, what challenges in particular developers might be facing, and what might be solutions to bringing in more private developers to build for economically weaker sections and so on. So if I could ask Vikram, perhaps for your thoughts on that to begin with, and then Aparna from Asha Impact as well.
Yeah, sure. So I think, as you rightfully said, the macro environment is there. Clearly, it's a huge priority for the government. And so if you think about what makes things successful, normally it's the macro environment regulation, then demand and supply. And clearly, one would argue that the demand is there, right? I mean, you just mentioned all the stats that it should be there for good, affordable housing. There should be demand. So I'd just like to spend a minute on the supply side, because I think that's where the real problems are. And I say this from a perspective, our philosophy at Asha Impact is we made some investments as an impact investor. We try and learn from those investments, and then we work closely with governments and other policymakers to try and kind of move the needle on a more macro level. So we have a couple of investments in the affordable housing sector. And essentially, if you look at the supply side piece, I think there are a couple of things. One is that, just the delay in approvals and all that can really kill the economics from an impact investor perspective. And the problem with approvals is, even let me step back things. So I think strategically it's a no-brainer that this is critical. It's really the execution and the details of the execution that's important, and particularly on housing and generally in urban infrastructure, because it's not just a central government thing. So while NITI Aayog and we've spent quite a bit of time with NITI Aayog on this, can come up with policies and thoughts, it's a state level issue, it's a city level issue, it's an issue of e-governance in terms of, you don't have mayors that are empowered to do things, you've got multiple decision makers at the city level. So if you talk about where some of the problems are on the supply side, one is in the approvals. Given the leverage that happens in the impact investing and in housing, where you are taking on debt, a 12-month deviation here or there can totally kill the economics from an investor standpoint. So that's one. Two is, even on the demand side, I think the role that governments play in building up the infrastructure, both the kind of hard infrastructure in terms of connectivity of people, etc., because it's unlikely that you're going to build some big affordable housing project right in the middle of New Delhi or Mumbai. So and then the social infrastructure. So I don't know, maybe I'll just hand it to Aparna, because we've done quite a bit of work on this, so in your thoughts. But the supply side, I think, there are lots of issues here. If we can try and crack the code a little bit on the supply side, I think we can make tremendous headway in actually getting, people into affordable homes.
Sure, thanks for that, Vikram. I think I'll just maybe pick up where you left it. So as Vikram said, as Asha Impact, we're actually two entities. So one, of course, is a platform through which we make our investments. But the Asha Trust is a policy advocacy platform as well that is working very closely with the government and different stakeholders in the affordable housing space to really catalyze and see what more can really be done to move the needle. And as Vikram rightly said, when we've gone out and spoken to a bunch of developers, right across the board from several large developers, medium and small developers, what we've really, I think the crux of it boils down to land parcels not really being available in the heart of the city because land is expensive, and as Vikram was alluding to this as well, sometimes the conversion of the land from agriculture to residential land can take up to 3 years. So that in itself sort of creates this sort of shortage of land within cities, and that's where most people really want to be. So what ends up happening is a lot of the development is coming up outside of city peripheries. And approvals then becomes an issue over there because this can be an extended process. A lot of these places are not really connected with good trunk and social infrastructure, and jobs is sort of the primary reason driving people away from some of these projects coming up outside. But again, back to what Bharat was also mentioning, 17% of India is currently living in slums, and that's because there isn't enough housing in cities. So people aren't really left with much of a choice but to take up housing over here. And the slums themselves come with a host of different difficulties, and we can get into that at a later point in the discussion. But the third thing I wanted to mention, what developers really face a challenge with is developer finance. And here again, I think there's a lot that maybe the government can do, because developers cannot access capital for financing land. And there are reasons for why those regulations came into place. What ends up happening is they're sourcing more expensive sources of capital, which again drives up the cost of housing. And this entire vicious circle again, making them build outside city limits. So I think those are broadly the challenges, and I think linking it back to sort of our topic today on sustainable cities, affordable housing is one of the key challenges that we do need to look at if we are thinking of sustainably building cities that are inclusive for everybody, and cities that sort of provide jobs and are really sort of engines of growth for our economy.
Thanks a ton for that, Vikram and Aparna. Just to switch to the conversation on waste next, given the fact that across these cities of ours we're generating over 60 million tons of waste annually, and we aren't, it's a massive amount of waste for any system to cope with, and it is proving to be a challenge. So if I could turn to two of the entrepreneurs that we have in the room that are working on waste, Sandeep from NEPRA and Shekar from Hasiru, Dala. And if I could ask both of you to comment on some of the fundamental challenges that we see while working across the waste value chain. Sandeep, maybe starting with you first.
Yeah, thanks. According to our understanding of the space, it's not the waste problem, it's the expectation mismatch, which is from the stakeholder perspective at the municipal body level or the generator level and all. So what's important is to match the expectation of every single stakeholder, either it's the generator, handler, as well as the disposal of the waste. Waste value chain can only be created if people are aware of segregation. So recycling can only happen if the infrastructure is created using the policy and the money available around it. And circular economy would support the sustainability of the cities in its own operations. So effectively what happens is we have, from our experience in multiple cities where we are actually interacting, we have seen that the city officials, they are always expecting the citizens to improve. Citizens are expecting the city officials to improve. Recycling companies are suffering because nobody is really acting and supporting at the municipal level or at the generator level. So exercise in the whole value chain creation is about matching the expectations. Expectations of funding, expectations of creating infrastructure, expectations of aligning the objectives not only of the government or the urban local body, but also of the entrepreneurs, the generators and everybody. Hence, the whole exercise for ensuring that how sustainable cities with proper waste management happen is by creating models where it's zero waste to landfill. And it is possible, and it is just the exercise from private sector has to be there, that they have to be catalyst to creating that expectation matching.
To sort of take on from where Sandeep left off, I think I just want to step back. One of the, like he was talking of expectations, right from the Prime Minister's office to people like IDC have said there is wealth out of waste, right? For example, IDC had this war program, right? I think most people don't understand that an end-to-end waste management system, that is from collection of generated waste to its safe disposal, is a negative value system, which means that someone has to pay for its management. And this is unfortunately not fully recognized amongst the citizens in general, the government in its policies, and so on. So, and who are those, but who pays for it? Only three sources of that money, right? One is the polluter or the waste generator. So the polluter pays principle has to be applied, or it has to be the manufacturers of products whose consumption creates the waste, so through the extended producer responsibility, or government through its taxes, all right? And we have seen in India that government through its taxes and the municipal corporations trying to do it have not done the best job. So I think we need to figure out business models that leverage the first two. And the way we have done it in Bangalore, for example, is actually fully go by the polluter pays principle, right? Bulk waste generator clients are our clients who we service. We have a direct contract with the bulk waste generator. He pays for the services. We integrate waste pickers who are at the bottom of the waste value management chain into the waste management process by making them entrepreneurs who actually deliver the services on the ground, professionalize their service, improve their working conditions, right? And today, like he said, segregation at source is extremely important. So you have to work at a policy level. So we work with the High Court to actually pass a law in Bangalore that three-way segregation is mandatory in Bangalore. Right? So today as a company, we actually do not pick up mixed waste. And we have a differential pricing so that they segregate better. So I charge nothing for dry, I charge something for wet, I charge the highest for sanitary and things. So if it's mixed waste, I actually charge it at the highest price, right? So there's an incentive to segregate better. And without segregation, you cannot do processing. Today, I'm glad to say that the experiment that we started off 3 years ago has actually worked. Today, we have more than 400 bulk waste generator clients, more than 200 waste picker jobs created, 21 waste picker entrepreneurs created and empowered. They actually have an asset to own in terms of a truck. More than 35,000 households segregating at source. We actually went EBITDA positive in 23 months, which means a social enterprise in the waste management sector can be a viable business. We actually went PAT positive last financial year. So the thing is, I think we need to get policies in place. We need to get citizens engaged. We need to get waste pickers involved for the whole system to work, so that you can actually break the mafia, as they call the garbage mafia, right? So, and the mafia exists, right? My trucks have been hijacked. My co-founder has been beaten up. My co-founder has got death threats, but we stood up, because the only way to stand up to a bully is to stand up, right? And today no one touches us. So that, I think there are models that can work. We have proven that it can work. And it is the integration of waste pickers, citizen engagement, and engaging with the policymakers, both, because waste is not just a business, it's a socio-political issue. So you have to work with all stakeholders. So we have a love-hate relationship with the BBMP, the elected representatives, the contractor who we are displacing, right? But it's part of the business, and it can be changed, and I'm very hopeful that it can be changed.
Thanks very much for that, Shekar. Ajit, if I could bring you into the conversation as well, especially on this point about the BBMP or the municipal corporations in general. What do you see as being the fundamental challenge there in terms of the governance structure of municipal corporations, in terms of their ability to engage on a problem like waste, working either with entrepreneurs like Shekar and Sandeep or independently on their own? Do you see that primarily as a governance challenge, or are there other elements to the challenge from the point of view of municipal corporations?
So I think from the municipal corporation level, what we're finding is it's a lack of actual knowledge more than anything else. That would be the primary sort of case. I wouldn't call that a failure, because the regulatory sort of infrastructure has come up over a long period of time. India came up with its waste management laws first in 2000. They were revised significantly in 2016, 16 years later, to provide some perspective of our learning curve on those. Now, from a regulation perspective, I don't think that's been a failure. It's been a fairly good regulation in terms of our understanding as a country of that, or what we could aspire to. But the failure has been on three folds. The first, I think, has been enforcement, which is very difficult to enforce if the people that are enforced don't have the knowledge. So we have to build capability across the whole food chain, right at the municipal level to higher levels. There's been local progress in many areas. For example, you might have seen, not in the impact investing space, but with huge impact, you had Ramki receive an investment from KKR earlier this year in this waste management space, a $600 million investment and $1 billion valuation for someone that's purely in waste management. So it tells you that the potential is there, and you're looking at someone who's for profit, looking at making good money over there. But it's in a selective part of the country where the processes are a bit more evolved. The problem that we have as a think tank and a policy organization for the government is to figure out how we can have that happen across places that aren't necessarily as lucrative. And the second failure that happens over there, I think, is in terms of the manner in which our urban local bodies are managed, which is that the amount of attention that they're given to the panchayat, they're given to all these other things, which are very rural in terms of our heritage, has been there. But the legacy shift has shifted as you've seen urbanization take place. The focus on the urban local body has not been there. So there are many areas where we've fallen behind, and that brings us to the second point, to what you said about why these municipalities haven't been able to be as effective as we'd like. And the main one I see outside of the knowledge is process and resources. And that resource question is one that we've been looking at a little more closely. You're probably seeing our fiscal deficit at a national level. Everyone pays attention to that. You look at it at the state level. We're looking at cities in India where property taxes are abysmally low, what is paid. So collections are low. It's not the rate we're talking about, but what actually comes in. We're talking about 0.2% of GDP. Global averages are 1.2, even from countries that are very average. Best practices are north of 2 and 3%. We won't have a state deficit. But there are political reasons why people don't want to go and collect those. There are other reasons. So if you want, one of the things that we've been thinking of, and we haven't made a move in that direction, is instead of collecting taxes at the top and then percolating down, at a local level itself, and we'd love to get inputs from others around here, where the services are rendered to where the capital is coming from. If there's better matching, we think that there might even be better people. People know that it's going to impact them. So we're trying to do some work over there over the next few months. But the failure, like I said, is not from a regulatory perspective. I think that framework has been done. The work is looking at processes in every area. The work is figuring out how it's going to get funded, which is a very important point. Who's going to pay for it and how it's going to get funded. The government, out of the three areas you mentioned, is one of them. But given that their revenues are limited and it's a state item or a local item, we've got to figure out how we can channel the private sector. I hope that addresses the questions you asked.
It does, Ajit. Thanks for that. And I was curious also about just another point that you mentioned when we spoke in terms of just the fragmentation of governance interests, if you will, across sort of multiple different agencies. So it's not just the municipal corporation that's responsible for many of these issues. It's a bunch of different bodies, parastatal and so on. So just curious for your views on that as well.
So yeah, one of the other areas, not specifically about just urban waste, but more broadly, earlier this year I was sort of asked to look at the Yamuna River project, which is a proposal to clean up the Yamuna. And so this is very close to where we are right now, and it's a story which is a very sad story, but you have a river that is coming to Delhi, the border of Delhi at the Viraj, which is full of life and is actually potable water. You'll see life in the river. And then it enters the city and it's a completely dead river. It leaves the river, the city completely dead, cannot support life, zero oxygen, and it takes another 100 kilometers downstream to come back to life. So this was a concern because you have the Ganga cleaning committee, and eventually when the Yamuna joins it, it's already cleaned up quite a bit, more because of dilution than anything else, of cleaner water coming from other places. So that river was dying in Delhi. The city of Delhi was killing the river, and we needed to find out why. And so that was an exercise when I started looking at all the different agencies involved. I realized that one of the big issues that we have, and perhaps NITI Aayog can play a role because we are an inter-agency organization, so we're trying to make some moves, trying to figure out where to begin in that process. But you have, Delhi has more than one government. It has the union central government. There's a certain portion of the city that's with them. We have a state government, which has a certain portion of the city with them, and then we'll go to why that state government is very relevant. And then we have municipal corporations that have certain responsibilities with them. And these responsibilities are, while they're defined for certain areas, there are certain areas that go beyond them. For example, the police, which is the enforcement agency, is a central government thing right across. So there are lots of these inter-agency things. The biggest problem initially was identified by the people proposing the problem as a Delhi Jal Board issue, which is the sewage was not getting treated and going in. As you move deeper, it is the other big failure that you had across all cities in India. The big failure is that of planning. So most of this urbanized growth we're talking about, and even when you refer to low-cost housing, all of that, what we really need is planning. And this planning is just, what I would say is, rather than just forecasting the future, it's forecasting all the impact that your decisions will have in the future. And that's been missing. Part of what's happened in Delhi is that a lot of illegal development, the slums that you talked about, are the biggest polluters. But whether it's equitable to just finish the slums off, and is that the solution, or is the solution that the current government of Delhi has by legitimizing them without thinking of where that waste will go, whether to deal with things at a decentralized level? These are the other questions we have. But there are more than 24 agencies involved, from the Delhi Jal Board to the municipal corporations to the central government to multiple agencies that were involved over here. And to get them working in tandem and figuring out how to sort of solve these jurisdictional issues for each item would be necessary to make that river, the Yamuna, which is now a dead river when it flows out of Delhi, clean again. So that was just an example about the number of agencies. There's the DDA, the Delhi Development Authority, central government, that is the developing agency, the corporation is the managing agency. So there are so many agencies. The other issue that we have is enforcement. So enforcement in an area like this, it's very difficult because if the transgression is by 99% of the population, very difficult to enforce. If it's 5–10%, you can enforce. So how do we change that public thinking? How do you make people sort of look at their area and see that how they can be a good citizen rather than asking the government to start taking care of them are areas that we are exploring.
And probably a lot of lessons there from what Shekar was describing as well in terms of ability to segregate and so on. There were also a couple of other points there in terms of the financing of some of these problems within cities and property tax collections and so on that I wanted to bring in both Viraj and Srikanth on. And maybe just to begin with you, Viraj, as also a good way to segue, based on Ajit's comments, from the themes of housing and waste to the one of governance, because that's something that underlies many of the problems that we face in urban areas. And one manifestation of that in particular that has been striking as we've been talking, Viraj, you and us, is the fact that most of our cities are dramatically understaffed when we compare them with any international norms. And so in that context, how do you get the city to function well and how do you get it to deliver on all of these services that we've been talking about is of course a challenge on which you've been doing a lot of work. So just curious for your point of view on that in terms of specifically the role that technology can play to help address that.
Yeah, I think any dimension you look at, whether it's financial from a resource point of view or people, our cities are hugely understaffed. And given the influx of people in the cities and the challenges we have in the growth phase, it can start a double whammy. So I think when you look at technology, again, technology is a solution. A lot of things need to line up from political will to the administrative support. But when it works, it really creates impact at speed and scale. So we have seen that working in a couple of states, across the state, like Andhra Pradesh, Punjab, Karnataka. I think if you look at the kind of supply side of a urban system, which is essentially administrators, IS officers, then the employees, and then the last mile employees. At each stage, we have seen what the difference technology can make. Because Dirk, you talk about data. When you put technology as a transaction system in a system, you get digital exhaust. So there is no I mean, I walk into so many commissioner's office and IS officers' offices, and they are putting together a last-minute report of how many properties are there in my city. What is the average property tax collected? But once you have a digital exhaust, it's an undisputable data, and you can easily just pull it off and give it off. So, like for example, Andhra Pradesh, which is using our system for the last 3 years, they conduct their reviews using dashboards. When they look at revenue deficits, they look at how much revenue they need and stuff like that. So that's very powerful at that level because and the second thing is accountability. The government works on accountability. So they can understand clearly which parts of the system is not performing, which city has collected, their waste on time, which city is collecting their property tax on time, where the service levels are, by city, by ward, by employees. That's the kind of accountability you can fix in the system. So we have interesting examples of that whole thing we're saying, that when there's a complaint filed on the system, and there's a whole closed loop that, it's like Uber. Once the complaint is, solved, the citizen has to certify it's solved and they have to rate. It's not closed before that. And the SLA only starts kicking, finishes them. So you have employees calling citizens saying, hey, please rate me, I've kind of solved your problem. So that's what a digital system does in terms of trust and in terms of transparency and driving. But employees' lives are also very difficult. If you walk into a undigitized urban local body office, you have piles of files. And a citizen walks in and says, I want to look at my last year's, property tax return. He has to go in, retrieve the paper, then look up some other thing that he has done. I mean, I think there was an estimate somebody did almost 30% of the time is retrieving paper. So when you digitize those things and somebody walks in and you put their mobile number or customer ID and you have all the details for the last 5 years, that's a huge sale. Thanks to you guys, we did a survey in Andhra Pradesh with the employees actually, because a lot of time the feeling is employees don't like technology because it has transparency and accountability and everything. On an average, the net promoter score was 73% for employees, which is like mind-boggling. It was higher than the citizens. And on average, they save 19 hours a week by using technology. So that's pretty powerful. And I think finally, if you kind of go down in terms of creating efficiency in the system, what you were referring to before, without changing the rates, because the whole process is automated from generating the demand for the property to putting the demand to the consumer and payment. And there's accountability in the system, you can measure it. From 361 crores of property tax collected in 110 other local bodies in 2015, Andhra Pradesh went to 810 crores. So that's the kind of impact just automation and transparency and accountability can have in the system. And also what we've seen is it also creates a positive kind of loop between citizen and the feedback that you were talking about earlier. It creates positive feedback loops. Once citizens knows that whatever they're doing, they're getting alerts, it's being resolved, and it's only resolved when they say it's resolved, they actually start participating more. So till about 2 years ago, on an average in a year, the whole state got 15,000 complaints. Today it's north of 100,000 because people see a positive action as a result of. And the beauty is, I think once it starts working, you can scale it very fast. So when we go to Punjab next, it takes us 90 days to replicate what we've done in Andhra Pradesh because it's all open source. So you can go from like 100 other local bodies to 500 very quickly. So that's the scale and speed you get with technology.
Really helpful. And there's an undercurrent of just behavior change among citizens as well as among administrators and so on that came out of the comments that Shekar was making, what you were talking about, Ajit, as well as your comments, Viraj. And especially this point about the property taxes, right? With no change in rates, no change in any sort of method of assessing and so on. There's an actual doubling in property tax collections just because you made it easier for citizens to pay their property taxes. It's a very powerful story. It's also a good segue to just talking about finances more broadly, and I'll bring Srikanth into the conversation at this point. Clearly, the question of finances, Srikanth, as we think about just the sustainability of cities and their ability to do everything that citizens are now demanding of them, in the context where the number of citizens coming into these cities is also exploding. It poses a massive problem for cities, and Ajit was talking about the fact that property tax collection rates are very low compared with global averages. And that's true in general for the state of the finances of our cities as well, not just on property taxes, but just in general. So just curious for your reflections on that as you've been working on this issue at Janaagraha, and also for sort of where you place the issue of finances in the broader context of the improvements needed for the cities.
Sure. Thanks, Bharat. So if I were to just zoom out and if I were to zoom out and locate the issue of municipal finance, the broader context of SDG level, I'd begin with the original sin of public policy making in India, which is our failure to recognize the city as a distinct unit of economy and governance. And this has cost us quite heavily over the last 2 decades, even as comparative economies and countries ranging from Philippines, Indonesia, South Africa, Brazil, Mexico, etc., have done much better in this sphere. So this is despite the 74th Amendment, and this plays out both constitutionally and statutorily. And we've genuinely shown across sectors, not just within government, a huge lack of imagination in treating the city as a place and a system and solving for it, which has resulted, therefore, in a somewhat false narrative and a fairly faulty diagnosis of looking at the city as an aggregation of sectoral challenges, rather than solving the city as a place and a system. So that's one important piece for us to bear in mind. And what this has led in turn to is the fact that we've done well in diagnosing quality of life sectors, and we've also succeeded in taking fairly tactical jabs, coming up with some really fantastic technocratic solutions. But over the last 2 decades, we've not been able to rapidly scale them and really transform the quality of life in our cities. And that's eating into productivity. Some estimates suggest about up to 3% of GDP of those cities in the long term. We see 4 broad areas that underpin many of these quality of life challenges, which we call city systems, of which one is municipal finance. And for us, the entire landscape comprises 4 city systems: spatial planning and design standards of public utilities. The second one is what we call urban capacities and resources, covering municipal finance, municipal staffing, and technology. The third is one of metropolitan governance and political leadership of the city. And the fourth is transparency and citizen participation. So we feel unless you solve all of these 4 simultaneously, all the other quality of life challenges will not get solved. And we can say this with reasonable conviction, having worked in this area for the last 2 decades. So this is where we locate municipal finance. So I want to sort of call out the fact that we don't believe municipal finance is a silver bullet, but we believe it's a great starting point, because it's an area that brings together different stakeholders. And because it concerns money, it's easy to line up incentives for different set of stakeholders quite objective. And of all the other areas that I called out, it's something where political incentives align very easily. So if you look at master planning, municipal staffing, political leadership and transparency and citizen participation, there are strong disincentives for imaginative policy making at the political level, given the structure of political parties in India and the anti-defection law. This doesn't exist in municipal finance, which uniquely places municipal finance as a potential catalytic solution. So that's the long context. Now responding to your particular question, yes, municipal finance is a huge challenge. The gap, the funding gap is larger than $1 trillion over 20 years. This excludes the cost of land acquisition, which itself would be a large cost. Some people have said India's urbanization will be the most expensive compared to all peer economies, simply because we have cities which are poorly planned and have resulted in urban sprawls and huge cost of land in the business district areas. So there are three sections to the municipal finance problem. One is the need to raise large amounts of capital. The second is to allocate them judiciously between sectors and geographies within a city. And the third problem is to manage that capital to deliver outcomes efficiently. And I think all of these three are challenges. I mean, again, ironically, we focused a lot on the second and third challenges, which is where should money go and is it being deployed efficiently. But we believe that a conversation on raising this capital is equally important, because building of urban infrastructure is going to be far more challenging than the challenges we've pretty much surmounted quite well in terms of telecom, power, oil and gas, rural roads, rural electrification, etc. Simply because cities are places where people live, work, recreate, and therefore building brownfield infrastructure at scale to cover 400 million people is going to be a non-trivial issue. I don't believe any country practicing democracy has ever done it before. So it will be a unique challenge for India. With the existing asset liability mismatches in financing of long-term infrastructure, which we are already seeing play out with IL&FS and before that the NPA problem, financing of urban infrastructure therefore is going to be even more complex. I will leave this conversation by saying that, however, there are green shoots. In addition to the routine improvements that we are seeing, albeit at a very slow pace in property tax collections and so on, we do believe that lining up the social impact sector with the municipal bond sector and looking at innovative project financing, including the conversation on SDG bonds and green bonds, presents a very unique opportunity for us to really fast track and deliver on urban infrastructure. And we'll have to do it at the same scale that developed countries like the US have done it. And by redirecting monies that are currently lying with the Employee Provident Fund Organization, Life Insurance Corporation, other life insurance companies and pension funds, which aggregate to close to 50 lakh crores, about 35 lakh crores in the life insurance sector, another 10 lakh crores with EPFO, another 2.5, 3 lakh crores with other private pension funds and life insurance corporations, is about 50 lakh crores. It's a lot of money, all of which is patient capital. So if we are able to design regulatory mechanisms at the national level for municipal borrowings and use that as a pressure point to clean up the accounting shop in cities, then we have a chance. But today's cottage industry type conversation on cleaning up bottom up at the municipal level, we don't believe will give you the kind of fast track, scalable solutions in municipal finance that we're looking at.
Terrific. Thanks, Srikanth. Ajit, if I could turn back to you, lots of interesting ideas that have come up across the table in terms of sort of innovations that can come in from private enterprises or from social entrepreneurs and so on, to help address some of the challenges that you're talking about. But in the context of the fragmentary nature of the urban government, in terms of the number of bodies that you mentioned, that needs to engage with entrepreneurs like this to be able to make a difference. How do you see cities sort of effectively engaging with both private sector as well as social entrepreneurs to be able to make a change in some of these areas? Do you see that as something that we've started making effective strides in some places? Do you have thoughts or advice both for some of the private sector participants as well as for people on government on how to make that a more effective process?
So one of the big changes that happened when the Planning Commission became the NITI Aayog, or was disbanded and became the NITI Aayog, was this whole, sort of conversation about the aspirations changing for India. And part of that mandate was the cooperative federalism, which is for us to figure out, because each state, a lot of these items are state items, is to engage much more at the state level and look at some of the manners or the different ways in which the central government or NITI Aayog itself can help build capability or look at what's happening at the state level and incorporate them. So they have joined. I think almost all the chief ministers and the heads of union territories are on the governing council of NITI Aayog. So it's something that we take quite seriously at a local level as well. We're trying to get involved. That said, a lot of what's happening at the city and at the even beyond the city level in certain states, we are not as aware of as we could be. So some of these ideas, entrepreneurs have gone directly to the states, have approached them, and have managed to get the state to lobby for them in getting waivers. For example, in terms of looking at segregation, for example, we have a law that has come out for segregation, which is a national law. We've had, Gurgaon right next door in Faridabad, which are together have EcoGreen setting up a waste-to-energy plant where they're put in more than 350 vehicles already. They're going to clean up this entire area, and it's a non-segregated model, which is an exception. So to operate on these exceptions of non-segregated, give exclusive rights, all of that, that is not the central government that has been lobbying for them. That's the state that comes and says, you have this regulation, we want this exception, we are going to use this person. So a lot that has happened and is happening today has been folks approaching at the state level and then even asking us to make exceptions at the central level. So a lot is happening all over, and it's not like the central government averse to it. One of the things that our CEO has been trying to do is take best practices in one area and show it in others. I think they've done it with the water index, they're doing it with a livability index, they're trying to do it across many indexes. So it's a naming and shaming. A lot of people in many different parts of the country don't know how bad they are until you compare them with others. And likewise, people that are doing well don't know how well they're doing until you compare them with others. So this benchmarking that has been discussed about today has been a very valuable exercise in terms of recognizing things, and then not just recognizing who's the worst, but also who's progressing the most. So we tend to rank even, who's been moving up in the ranks a lot across a lot of these indexes. I don't know whether that answers your question.
That's really helpful, thank you. I do want to turn this over in a few minutes to other people in the room who might have thoughts or questions or comments. But before I do that, I just wanted to get a different perspective from investors as we think about how we can get more private capital in to engage on some of these spaces. When we think of affordable housing or waste or even issues of governance, clearly the availability of capital at the government alone is probably going to be insufficient, despite everything that's happening from the point of view of sort of improving government finances here. So if I could turn it over to Karthik from Asha Impact to talk a little bit about your perspective on what you see as maybe more effective ways to get in private capital into some of these spaces.
Sure, thank you. No, I think that's exactly right, that even though the government is always going to be the biggest player in many of these sectors, we do need private capital, and private capital is coming in. Asha example is Asha Impact is one example of that. And these are difficult sectors, capex intensive. When 3-4 years ago, when Vikram and Prabhakar set this up, I mean, we chose these sectors. We knew they were difficult, but they were also very strong policy, regulatory, support and tailwinds. So how has it been? I can summarize, right? So in a nutshell, the housing finance market, as all of us know, has scaled up well. There's been a lot of traction. The regulator has done a decent job. Refinance. It's also, like the microfinance, the availability of talent and capital entering the sector. So it creates a very positive environment in innovation using technology for underwriting collections. And of course, all of this notwithstanding what's currently going on in the markets and the fundamental issues with asset liability mismatch and whatnot. But overall, it can be said that housing finance has grown well. And as I think Vikram and others have pointed out, the supply side has not been so good. There's an economic issue here in affordable housing. Land is like an inventory, not a price appreciating asset, so you have to sell it quickly. The issues, we know what they are, approvals, builder finance, and so on. And I want to actually get back to what Srikanth said, because that's really what it is, that these sectoral challenges, I think they're important, and the governance needs to come together, and that's precisely why this SDG framing is useful. SDG 11, right? We don't have an SDG for housing, we don't have an SDG for waste, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? So whatever it is, it suddenly jumps to 11. and all of us collectively are facing this. So I think this is a very important conversation. So what are some of the key issues, some of the learnings from the investor perspective? Number one, let's put this on the table. Despite the government's will, very strong will, implementation has been a huge challenge. Look at Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, real economics, the CLSS scheme has not met its targets, and we can give specific examples of that. I'll raise one which links to the urban issue, which is this notion of building affordable housing in a center of a town. The government has talked about PPP, and should we unlock government land to build affordable housing, and what can be the models for that? Or other people, urban development folks specifically say, no, that's not the right idea. You should actually build affordable housing outside the city, and the bigger issue is connectivity and local jobs and so on and so forth. And maybe even incentivizing the build out of the metro using property taxes and things like that. So it does need to be looked at in that context. And the PMAY issue is exactly that. It applied to the city limits. So if you're building affordable housing right outside the city limits, which is usually where you would build it, it doesn't apply. And it was just a small little oversight. When the government did it for MIG, for the middle income group, they changed it. So there actually it can be anywhere, and it was changed here too. So credit to the government based on that. The PPP models we spoke about, the cities versus the periphery. So, and really it's, the other issue is we speak a lot about group housing, but what about self-built housing? That's like 70% of the solution. So group housing helps us make sure the problem doesn't get worse going forward. It needs to be addressed. But there's a lot of to be done in self-built housing. And I think, look, the interest that's there in social housing, all these funds that are being set up, the United Nations, Dirk, who's here today, hosted a big roundtable on this. They're setting up a social housing fund, right? There's this notion of green bonds and how that learning can be applied to, muni bonds and scaling that up, which Srikanth already alluded to. And finally, all of this discussion around green construction and precast. So there's a lot of exciting developments here. 3-4 years ago, you would not have seen, I would say, housing developers. People at Impact Investors Council talk about housing, but I would say there's maybe 3 impact investors, one is Asha Impact and a few others, who actually invested in builders. Right? We usually talk about, so that's really where the challenge is at, and how do you grow that? And similarly for waste. Sandeep is here, Shekar is here, and we have other companies as well. Who would have thought, that like 3 years ago, waste management would be like such an attractive sector? When we had the Asha Impact annual event, we focused just on 2 sectors, housing and waste. And why is that? Again, it's because of 2 reasons. It's because of positive policy regulatory headwinds, EPR, solid waste management guidelines, the overall Swachh Bharat, municipalities actually having the pressure to do something about this, and corporates having the pressure to do something about this, which gives companies like yourselves an opportunity to go to them and say, hey, look, now you don't have to convince them less, right? So I think it's fantastic. And then the business side of it, the use of technology, as we've seen in NEPRA's case, sourcing at scale and processing at scale to drive up the gross margins of the business using optical technology for sorting, and then for customer acquisition. So they have this app. It helps drive efficiency, logistics, as you're collecting from different waste pickers, but it also has a social impact angle. I actually see this myself, where every guy they pick up from, they weigh the thing, and then they take a picture of him to ensure there's no child labor. And it's just beautiful, because there's impact in there, and they're weighing his collection, and then it gets matched at the factory. If he's given less than he's supposed to, his deduction happens. So it's like, there's an amazing use of technology, business models that's going on, and that's being supported by the government side. So the investors are actually optimistic, cautiously optimistic, and that's a big deal. That when you say a sector like affordable housing building or dry waste management, commercial capital is starting to look at that. Exactly the example that you gave, sir, which is KKR's investment into Ranki, and we are expecting more such transactions to happen. So fairly optimistic.
Thanks, Karthik. I'd also like to bring Dirk back in for just any international examples and particular success stories that you're seeing internationally in terms of especially having businesses collaborate with governments on some of these SDG 11 parameters, particularly waste and housing that we've been talking about. So any reflections on that and any international success stories that would be worth sort of knowing about and emulating?
To be honest, I do not have it necessarily on waste management, although I know it, but I don't know enough, so I don't want to bother people with it. On housing, absolutely. There are some very good examples in Europe, in the Netherlands, but also in the US, for example, where there are, with a good regulatory framework, private sector is encouraged to use brown site development in a mixed way, right? So you have the most expensive tower blocks that go up in the most attractive places, but they can only do that if they also have a certain percentage of social housing or affordable housing as part of the larger project. And so there's very, very good examples. I haven't seen it as much here in India so far, but I know, for example, places like New York and Amsterdam, where sometimes up to 50%, you know, to really for private developers to build in these most attractive places. And obviously, you know, the high floors and the penthouses, etc., are fully commercial, but then at the same time it needs to be mixed in. And then all of a sudden you see private actors who come in and will clean up, you know, because often these places are polluted as well, and these are often difficult sites. But because you know the regulatory framework is right and the pricing is right, and all of a sudden, even in this really difficult, I mean, an early example is Canary Wharf, for example, in London, where you see this kind of mixed developments, very much driven by the private sector. And so, I mean, these prime sites, even, you know, I wouldn't discard it also in the Indian context, right? Because I think a lot of your cities are so spread out. You need this development. You need, if you want to talk about sustainability, right? You need to be building more densely than you are. You cannot just keep on spreading out and sprawling. It really has to come there. And I think you know, so there are I think plenty of examples internationally of how that can be done by, I mean, with the commercial, the private sector playing a key role in that.
Perfect. Thank you very much. This has been a rich and fascinating discussion. I know there are other people in the room who might either have questions for some of our discussants or who might have comments of their own to make. I'd request you to keep it brief. We do need to wrap in about 10 minutes or thereabouts. But other comments, questions? Let's start with the lady here.
I have a follow-up question for you. I was just wondering whether you could point to any examples of mixed income housing, you know, in a global South or, you know, Indian context, because I don't see much of that in India, and I'm wondering why that's the case.
I'm not sure I'm the best person to answer that, right? Because I think it might be a historical, a cultural thing. I don't know exactly, but I mean, in Amsterdam, for example, there's a long tradition. It's actually almost the other way around, where, you know, about 50% of the housing stock was social, and they actually tried to move towards a more commercial, you know, and have more private development, you know, and to change that percentage to sort of, you know, 25% social, which was a good way to bring in, you know, the private sector, because they were, of course, you know, interested in the market part of it, but still being with. But so you see, I mean, I don't know these examples here, but in New York City, for example, right, a big tower, you know, overlooking the river, you know, in very desirable places. You know, the top floors will all be, you know, highly commercial, and then the bottom floors are, you know, need to have a you know, affordable rate. So, you know, it's just this mix, or there's sort of lower buildings around it, around the space. But what is the requirement to have park space? You see a lot of greening, for example, in New York, because there's a specific regulatory framework that says if you want to build up high, you know, and get those hyper expensive spaces that you build, it means you also need to create public green space around it as a sort of a counterbalance. So, but I don't know in the Indian context, you know, what the reasons are that have. Maybe there are examples that I'm not aware of. But I mean, yeah, I know it mostly in the Western world, where it's totally acceptable to really mix the top prices with some of the affordable housing.
All the townships have to be mixed income. So there's a portion which is NEWS category. So any township that you get certified does have the regulation for it.
It's just a question of it being enough, I think. But we are seeing examples of this in India as well. As you were, I didn't catch your name.
Sandeep.
As Samir was mentioning, so every builder that's building now has to allocate, at least large builders, I can talk about that, need to allocate a certain percentage of that complex to EWs and LIG housing. It's just a question of there being enough and actually being able to enforce that.
So I think we have the time only for a couple more comments. I'm going to invite the lady here and the gentleman there.
My name is Kumar and I work with an organization called Climate Bonds Initiative. And I just wanted to emphasize and take the point that Srikanth was making about scale and speed of mobilizing. It's the raising capital part of it. And I would really urge that we look at the potential of green city bonds to be able to raise money at scale for actually addressing the problem of sustainability in a very holistic manner. Now, green city bonds do not only look at the ULBs, but these could be also other private agencies which could raise money either domestically as well or offshore issuances. We do have example, I mean, traditionally our municipal finances have relied on grants, on state grants. So of course there are things that need to be speeded up and things, management systems have to change. But what is the low-hanging fruit is, I think, the smart cities mission. I think we have at least in front of us, despite all the challenges, the top investment grade cities, at least 10 or 11 of them, within which these green bond issuances can be piloted. Government has been giving a lot of impetus to that, but that push, that political push that is required will definitely will speed up. We are working with and we are looking at the other thing that we could do is, and this also talks about, say, a little bit about the design when you're looking at raising finances. We have done these reports elsewhere in other countries, green investment opportunities that can be, or reports on these, which can actually be done city for city, so that we take a forward look in terms of climate resilience, disaster risk mitigation, climate mitigation, carbon emission mitigation, because all of them have impact on societal or job creation as well. So since we have, and we are going to report on SDGs as well, the role of cities and connecting cities to other cities in the world, using models that have worked elsewhere, like value capture model. So looking at metros, how do they raise financing? All of this is very much possible. The idea is to sort of sit together and give it a push. And we'll be very happy to talk to NITI Aayog, to Janaagraha, to other investors. We can, because we work globally on this. There is interest in environmental financing through market-based mechanisms. So all of this basically requires a little bit of strategic interventions. There may be cities which would probably need credit enhancement. That is also possible. Ratings, all of those structures are